Okay, I've got to record today because apparently my mic didn't work on the last time I did this for one of my classes. So let's go back and kind of review and talk about what we got to last time. If you remember, I told you guys that the British and the program the British are going to embark upon is going to try to do two things to us after the end of the French and Indian War. Because of the British economic situation, because they're broke, the British are going to try to do several things. One, they're going to try to get us back under the Navigation Acts, which means that we're going to have to trade only with them, only with the British, on British ships, with British crews, okay, and that will generate revenue for the mother country, and they will be happy, okay. The other thing that they're going to try to do is they are going to embark upon a plan to try to get us to pay for about 1/3 of our own defense. The way that they're going to do that is they are going to tax us, which is going to be disastrous. They're going to ask us to pay for housing and quartering the troops that are here, which of course, again, will be disastrous. We hate it. So, I told you guys that in 1765, Parliament will pass the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act was designed to help us, of course, come to that realization that we are going to have to pay for some of this. The reaction to the Stamp Act was swift and brutal. The Sons of Liberty began, which today I told you we would classify as a domestic terrorist organization. They were violent towards stamp officials. They would tar and feather them, burn their houses, burn the places that they work. Okay. The colonies even came together to put into place a boycott and to try to get rid of the Stamp Act by simply either not obeying it or boycotting the goods, namely paper, that were taxed by the Stamp Act. Okay? The result, Parliament repeals the Stamp Act in 1766. After a year of fussing and fighting, the British will repeal the act, and we get our way. So this is, if you want to think about it, a victory for the Americans who claim that Parliament has no right to tax us because we do not have a representative in Parliament. I told you guys, we talked a little bit about the difference between or what the British perspective was versus what the real perspective is, okay? That the British, they feel like Parliament represents every British citizen virtually, okay? No matter where you are, you're a British citizen and therefore you can be taxed, okay? Or what we think, okay, that we need a representative in Parliament that we elect in order for Parliament to be able to tax us. All right, it's not done, okay? The English still need us to pay, okay? And so the next wave is actually a disguised form of taxation, okay? Thanks in large part to that guy, Charles Townshend, who is Secretary of the Exchequer. The Exchequer in parliamentary office is like our treasurer, okay? So he oversees the finances. And Charles Townshend comes up with a plan, okay, to raise revenue from us without having to try to do a direct tax, okay? So what he did was he diverts revenue. to trade. Okay? So essentially what he's going to try to do is disguise this revenue raising operation in the form of duties. Okay? What is a duty? Tax on imports. Okay? And so the way it works is it really is designed to protect your natural sort of home businesses. Okay, you make foreign goods more expensive so that your goods can compete with foreign goods. Okay, so it's like a tax on imports. Okay, and so what Townsend says is the colonists must import these things. Okay, paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. Okay, think about it. We can't grow tea here in America, so we have to import that. Okay, we don't have any way to make some of this stuff, so we have to import it, and we have to import it from England. And so what England's simply going to do is put a duty on it, a tax on it, which we will have to pay in order to get those goods. What's probably the biggest sticking one? What do you think? Yeah, why? Well, that hasn't happened yet, though, but you do know that, okay? So we're a ways from that, okay? A couple of years. So you guys know about the Boston Tea Party. You've heard it, okay? And you know that we aren't particularly fond of this notion of having to pay extra taxes on tea. All right, let's take a time out for a second. You understand the importance of tea to the colonial diet, right? How do the British drink tea? And what else? Like coffee. Okay, it's hot. So it's served hot, usually just like we do with coffee, with milk and sugar, cream and sugar, okay? Milk and sugar. So tea was a huge part of the colonial diet. Okay, tea was served all the time. Okay? And it was really a part of their everyday lives. So every household had to have tea. So it has to be bought. It's this commodity that the colonists are going to buy no matter what. Okay, think about some of the things that you guys buy no matter what. Okay, I mean, for God's sakes, we buy water, right? You can go turn on the tap and get water, but we do what? Buy water in bottles. Okay. It's the same kind of principle. You're going to have it. Everybody's going to buy it. Okay? And tea is one of those things that the colonists really must have. So this is a revenue-generating idea. Okay? But you disguise it. Nowhere does that say that this is a tax, right? Okay? It's a duty. Well, most Americans are pretty smart enough to realize that. All right, what's the colonial response to this? Okay, the colonial response to the Stamp Act had been pretty bad, right? So what are we so ticked off about having to pay duties on these things that we bring in? All right, great question. We're really ticked off about it, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples. But this one is one that catches a lot of people's eye. Even though they may agree that some of these things have to be imported and duties are fine, this sticks in some people's craw. Okay, increasing custom officials at American ports, a board of customs in Boston. We're already mad because what? We have a standing army here. Now what? We got more British officials pouring in to collect the duties. Nobody likes that. All right. Well, the first response is a boycott, which you shouldn't be surprised about. That's really one of the most effective things that we do. Okay? We will, in many cases, the non-importation movement or boycotts, as you really want to kind of think about them, they are the most effective thing. Okay, when we just, and look, for a boycott to be effective, everybody has to do it. Okay, one person can't just stop. Okay, it's like people that are mad about the NFL's stance on racial equality and things like that. So they get mad and they say, well, I'm not going to watch the game. Okay, but that's one person. Okay, what you have to do to be effective is get 300 million Americans to stop doing it, right? And then that will be effective. Okay, but one person, if you get all the Americans to stop importing paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea, then what? How much money are the British going to be collecting off of the duties then? Zero. Okay? So non-importation movements, especially if they're effective, if we can get enough people to agree on a boycott, then that works pretty well. Okay? There's violence associated with this. One of the most famous was all to do with John Hancock's ship, the Liberty. All right. Hopefully all of you have seen a copy of the Declaration of Independence. The biggest signature on the Declaration of Independence is John Hancock's. Okay? Why? It was said that he wanted to sign it so big that the king wouldn't need his spectacles to read it. Okay? So he is pretty fierce about his opposition to the British by the time we get to 1776. John Hancock was very successful in Boston, had several ships, okay, but the British are concerned about smuggling. Remember those writs of assistance I told you about? Go back to 1761, where they could board ships, go into your homes, checking for smuggling, okay? Well, what do they think? The Americans are trying to get around the duties because they have this boycott going on. And so how are they getting their hands on some of these goods? They are smuggling them, okay? And one of the people they try to pin this on is John Hancock. They board his ship looking for smuggled materials, okay? And riots break out in Boston Harbor over the British searching of the Liberty. That leads to an additional 4,000 British troops being sent to Boston. Okay, the Bostonians are really unhappy. Okay, and you can probably guess why. Nobody wants more troops in and amongst you. But the first one up there, at least for us, especially in this class, is interesting too. Because this is really one of the first things that you start to see Americans that are part of the Enlightenment, that have been part of the Enlightenment, starting to appeal to some of those Enlightenment ideals. Okay? John Dickinson writes Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. And if you go and take a look at it, and we're going to go and zoom over here and take a look at it for a second. If I can get the internet to work. See if they have. So Dickinson, that's him, writes this series of letters, all right, called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. All right, you got to understand that Dickinson is not just your common everyday farmer, okay? Very well educated, pamphleteer, writer, thinker, okay, statesman. So he's not, all right, your normal, everyday, uneducated, backwoods farmer, all right? So he writes this series of essays that call into question the British idea about the these duties not being taxed, or not being taxes, okay? So, in summary, look at that part right there. Acknowledging the power of the British Parliament in matters concerning the whole British Empire, Dickinson argued that the colonies retain the sovereign right to tax themselves. All right, why? We don't have a representative, okay? We don't have a voice in Parliament, okay? And so they were really what he is kind of saying is that taxes, no matter what, remember what I told you about the Townshend duties, right? They were technically not taxes, they were duties, but they're also taxes. And so what Dickinson says, it doesn't matter if it's a direct tax like the Stamp Act or a duty like what they're calling these, they're illegal. Okay, we shouldn't have to pay them because we don't have a representative in Parliament. Okay, so when you see this, this is really the beginning of one of the things that has a big impact on Americans. Okay, the Enlightenment, the ability to expose some of these arguments. Pamphleteers, writers, newspapers would carry these things colonial-wide. And so everybody would read them, okay? Look, you got to understand, it's a different time. Okay, colonial society and colonial ways of life are very different from yours. There's no cell phones, okay? There's no TV. So when you were at home at night, what'd you do? You read, okay? And people read voraciously because if you could read, it's the only way that you can get news. It's the only way that you can get information, okay? And it's the only thing that you can do sometimes to pass the time, okay? So they read. They read whatever they could find. Now, some of the arguments are going to have to be, they're going to be complex, and you have to kind of be a little bit educated to understand them. Others are going to appeal to emotion and other things, and you're going to see these American pamphleteers and writers and thinkers start to appeal to common everyday Americans, not just the enlightened folk. What I tell you guys, 1/3 of the colonists will be all that we'll ever get on the side of the patriots. Okay? 1/3 of Americans remain loyal, and 1/3 don't give a you-know-what. Okay? So, you've got to appeal to enough people to get people involved, okay? All right. This won't be the first time you see a response like Dickinson's letter from a farmer, okay? We'll see more coming, okay? All right. In 1770, in March of 1770, we have our first instance of true violence. The Boston Massacre. Is it a massacre? Well, no, but the colonials and the patriots are going to call it that, and that's what it becomes known as, okay? If you know anything, if you've ever read anything or seen anything about the Boston Massacre, you know that we, the Americans, aren't necessarily innocent in this whole thing either, okay? So, let's go back in time and figure out what happens here as best we can, because we still don't exactly know some of the things that happen here, okay, because it's our best guess, but whatever, okay? If you look at Patrick Henry, or if you look at Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre, which becomes the best known scene from this episode, you'd think that, look at it, it's a piece of propaganda, okay, for our side. If you look at it, what do you see? These British soldiers willy-nilly firing into a crowd of innocent Americans, right? Like, to make it even more, I don't understand why he didn't do this. I mean, what he probably should have done is have them, bayoneting the poor dog down there, okay, to drive the point home. But what he's trying to do is, of course, drum up support for the American cause, okay? All right, remember, I just told you guys a few minutes ago that 4,000 additional British troops were sent to Boston to help collect the customs duties, to help enforce those duties because riots had broken out. Okay, and really, technically, according to the Quartering Act that had already been passed, who was really supposed to be paying for all that? The Bostonians were, which of course makes them unhappy. These guys, these British soldiers, most of them are pretty young. It's maybe the first time they've ever been abroad. Okay. They're easy targets. Everybody can see them coming in those glorious red coats. All right. Now, the British Army was the best trained, best equipped, best led force probably in the world at this time. Okay, they're good. But even they can make mistakes. Okay. We call them redcoats, obviously, because of the long red coat that they wore, the long great coat that they wore. But sometimes they were called lobsterbacks, not because of the red coat, but because their backs were scarred because they had been repeatedly beaten over time by their officers for not doing what they're supposed to do. That's an officer right there. Okay, officers carried a stick. And if you weren't doing your job, they would take that stick and whack you across the back to make sure that you were doing what you're supposed to be doing. These British soldiers were on patrol in Boston. And the American colonists tended to, especially the Bostonians, tended to do bad things to them. Okay, they didn't like them there in the first place. So they would jeer at them, they would hurl insults at them. When they came by, kids would throw snowballs at them. Okay, so it's not an easy job to be a British soldier stationed in Boston. You were going to come under attack regularly, either verbally or sometimes physically. When March, it's still cold. Okay. This group, it was supposedly kind of early evening, and they were on patrol in Boston. And a sometimes described as a drunken mob will see these guys out on patrol, and they'll start throwing snowballs at them. And then they start throwing snowballs with rocks in them. And then they start throwing rocks or ice or whatever they can find, okay? And it turns into a pretty ugly scene. The British soldiers are concerned. Of course, they think that this mob is about to attack them. They form up, they draw in, they close ranks. The Americans get close enough, yelling at them, throwing at them, that the British can strike some of them with their rifles, which they do. And in the midst of all this frenzy, we don't know what happens next. We don't know what side it comes from. We don't know who yelled it, but someone yells fire. And the British soldiers respond by firing a volley into the crowd. They will kill several colonials, wound several others. The most famous casualty, and really it's sometimes one of the most kind of perplexing casualties, the Boston Massacre, was a guy named Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was, we don't exactly know. Some people think he was an escaped slave. Some people think he was a freed slave. Okay, don't exactly know. But somehow or another, he's in Boston and is killed in the Boston Massacre. And so technically, one of the first casualties of the American Revolution is either a escaped slave or former slave. Kind of strange. But anyway, the Boston Massacre is important because, one, it's your first example of violence. But two, what the British do next is rather amazing. To try to calm things down, and in a gesture really of good faith, the British allow these soldiers to be arrested and then put on trial. Here in America, in American courts, in Boston, for God's sake, for murder. Those soldiers would be defended by a Bostonian law or a Boston law firm, headed by who? A soon-to-be, relatively soon-to-be president named John Adams, and his law partner, Josiah Quincy, who would name his son after, who then becomes president. Okay? John Quincy Adams. So John Adams actually defends these soldiers in court against their charges. And he gets most of them off. Okay? A couple of soldiers and the officers, I think 4 in total, would be convicted of technically of manslaughter. And they would be branded as murderers. You'd get an M branded on your hand. And instead of going to prison there, they were shipped back to England. The other ones were found to be innocent. Relatively. After the Boston Massacre, believe it or not, things calmed down. It's almost like, you guys know what a pressure cooker is? Okay. You guys know you throw the pressure cooker on your stove, okay, you put whatever you're going to cook in there in it, you seal it up, okay, and pressure starts to build, okay? And as that pressure starts to build and gets higher and higher, the temperature gets higher and higher too. Okay, so you can cook food really fast in a high pressure environment. The problem is that if your pressure cooker doesn't work correctly, all right, and the pressure builds up too high, what happens? It'll explode, okay? And so the Boston Massacre is almost like that. It's almost like a pressure cooker that's gotten too hot, too fast, and it explodes. Well, then what happens? All the pressure is gone, and so what happens? The temperature goes back down, okay? And so after really the Boston Massacre, you don't have a whole lot of things happening. The British kind of take a wait-and-see approach, almost a conciliatory approach. Okay? They don't start passing any new laws. They concentrate on trying to end smuggling. So one of the few incidents that you do have is the Gaspé. The Gaspé incident is one of my favorites. Sometimes this doesn't even get talked about much, but to me, it shows you kind of what's going on during this period. I told you that the British are out there trying to make sure we're obeying the laws, and we have a very poor record of doing that. So the British had these revenue ships out there that would chase down American ships, especially those they thought were smuggling. And the Gaspé is one of those. Okay, it's a British revenue schooner essentially. Okay, and its job was to chase down American vessels, board them, make sure they're not smuggling things. The Americans hated them. The Gaspé is chasing an American ship off the coast of Rhode Island, and it runs aground. Okay, it runs up on some rocks off the coast, low tide. Okay, British captain may not have been familiar with the waters he was actually in, and he runs up essentially on some rocks and gets pinned there during low tide. So he can't move, the ship won't move. The Rhode Islanders, seeing their opportunity, row out to the ship, board it, okay, take the captain and the crew hostage, shoot the captain in the buttocks, and force all of them off the ship, and then they burn it. Okay, so the Gaspé is set on fire. Now, look, technically that's an act of war. Attacking a British naval ship at a time of peace and setting it on fire and shooting the captain in the rear end, that's an act of war. Just a few years earlier, okay, in 1739, a war broke out between the British and the Spanish over the Spanish slicing off part of a British captain's ear. The War of Jenkins' Ear, as it becomes known, was done and breaks out because of that. Does war break out between us and the British over the Gaspé? No. Are the British happy about it? No. Do they want the Rhode Islanders to pay for the damage? Yes. Do they? No. Okay. So I told you, things had calmed down. What if this had happened right after the Boston Massacre? Okay. Would we have gone to war then? I don't know. Okay. But the British are trying to take a much more smooth approach, if you want to think of it that way. Oops, wrong way, dummy. All right. After the Boston Massacre, the colonies decided to try to keep in touch with one another. And some of those people that had attended the Stamp Act Congress, for example, some of those that were considered to be patriots, they began to write to one another to keep each other informed. Hey, what are the British doing in your colony? Okay. So here's another example of what I was telling you, using the power of the word to try to drum up more support. So these committees of correspondence, as they were called, right, would write to the other colonies, write to the other British colonies and say, hey, what are the British doing in your colony? Here's what we are doing. Okay? And here's what we think we ought to be doing. And so these letters would get sent to the other colonies, and everybody, these committees of correspondence, would have a pretty good idea about, if you're in South Carolina, okay, you would have a pretty good idea about what was going on in Boston. Okay? And that's what they're designed to do, keep everybody informed and try to get more and more people involved. Okay? This is going to be handy for what happens next, because now we're getting to a point to where we start to see things speed up. Okay, after kind of a calm period, things are going to start speeding up. Okay, and that's what we're going to kind of get to. Remember, I told you the British are actually taking a pretty conciliatory approach, right? They think Lord North, who is one of the major leaders of British Parliament at this time, Lord North thinks this act, the Tea Act in 1773, is a good idea. Okay? So I want you to kind of understand that he thinks this is a good idea. The Americans are going to have a totally different response to this. Okay? All right. Once again, we're back to tea. In England, there is a major company. It is a huge company, okay, called the British East India Company. The British East India Company is a think about today's huge companies like Walmart, okay, or like Microsoft, okay, that not only are big but have a big scope, almost a global scope, right? The British East India Company is a major trading company. Its responsibility was trading with, as you can probably guess from the name, Far East, okay? China, India, whatever. The British East India Company had run into some hard times, okay? And it needed kind of an infusion of capital because it had kind of started to struggle. There were a lot of members of Parliament who owned shares of the British East India Company. They've invested in it because they're wealthy, okay? And so they certainly don't want to see it fail, okay? Excuse me. Put yourself in the same situation, okay? All right? For some reason, we elect you president. God knows why, okay? You have half of your family's fortune tied up in Microsoft stock, okay? And so, whether consciously or not, if you have the opportunity to influence the government to purchase computers from one particular company, what would you do? Okay? You see what I mean? And so these guys have tons of money invested in the British East India Company. They certainly don't want to see it fail. And so what Parliament decides to do, okay, is to grant the British East India Company a monopoly on trading tea to the American colonies. They're going to be the only company that can trade tea with the American colonies. That revenue would help them out, and it would make sure that this British company would not fail because of the new capital that it would raise from selling tea to the colonies. All right. Lord North and Parliament passed this act, and they really believed that they were doing the Americans a favor. Okay? Because tea from the British East India Company would be sold direct from the Far East to the American colonies. With no middlemen, it would actually make the tea cheaper. Okay? So essentially, what Parliament and Lord North think they're doing here is giving the colonists a break. Yes, I understand that the British East India Company is going to have a monopoly. You can only buy tea from the British East India Company. But it's cheap tea. So you should be happy, right? Are we? Why? What's the sticking point? You guys aren't rebellious enough. Okay? We must have beaten you guys into submission here. What's wrong?
They get what they want.
It's cheap. We should get what we want, right? I mean, but the British government gets what it wants too. Okay? And like we said, Lord North thinks these guys are going to pick this tea because it's cheap. But we hate it. Why? I want you to think about this, okay? Not only is Parliament taxing us, which we think is illegal, but what else? Now they're telling us what? And what else?
You can only buy stuff from us.
And what else? It may be cheap now, but what? We don't have a choice, right? So yes, they could raise the price on us, and probably will, anytime they want to. And that's a problem. A lot of Americans see this, a lot of patriots see this as just one more example of heavy-handedness on the part of the British. Now they're telling us what we have to buy. Now they're telling us who we have to buy it from. If we allow this to happen, then what? What's next? Are they going to tell us where we have to buy our food? Are they going to tell us where we have to buy our clothes, right? What does it result in? Now you can say it. Boston Tea Party. Okay. What actually happens at the Boston Tea Party?
A group of colonists who dress in Native American.
Yep, they dress up like Native Americans and
British ship.
they get on the ships, and you can see out there, what are they doing? Tossing the tea out into the harbor. Okay? So really what the Bostonians had done is closed off the harbor. They wouldn't unload the tea. They wouldn't allow the British East India Company ships to dock so that the tea could be unloaded. And then they went out there and, dumped the tea out into the harbor. Now look, we all think that's funny, okay? But that's millions of dollars worth of British East India Company property. Okay? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars really worth of British property dumped into the harbor. And of course, the British are furious, right? Wouldn't you be? This is it. You want to talk about a turning point? This is one. Because the British have had enough, okay? You guys have all seen it, okay? The petulant child at Walmart, all right? Screaming, crying, snot flying everywhere. Sometimes the parent puts their foot down and says, you're not getting whatever you want, right? Sometimes the parent reaches that boiling point, and you've all seen it, right? The child gets the whooping, and that's kind of settled that, okay? The British are at that point, okay? They have had enough of us. How do we know that? In response, the British passed a series of acts called the Coercive Acts. We view them as so harsh here in America, we call them what? Intolerable. Okay? So a parliament decides that they've had enough of us and they are going to punish, us is a big term. They're going to punish Boston. Wrongly, the British have this idea that all of the American problems are in where? Boston. Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, Boston. Okay? Now that is not true. It's just the Bostonians are a little bit more rebellious and take a little bit more action than anywhere else. Okay? And so the Coercive Acts, they single out Boston. I'll give you an example. The Boston Port Act or the Boston Port Bill. Anybody want to take a wild guess what that one does? Closes the port of Boston to trade. Where does Boston get most of its revenue from?
Right.
Bing, bing. Okay. So Boston Harbor is shut down. The Massachusetts Government Act is next. Anybody want to take a stab at what that one does? If the Boston Port Act or the Boston Port Bill closed down Boston Harbor, what do you think the Massachusetts Government Act does? It closes down Massachusetts government. Makes Massachusetts now a royal colony under the direct control of, take a wild guess, the king. So it revokes Massachusetts charter, puts Massachusetts under direct control of the king. Number 3, a quartering act, another quartering act. Since troops have to be sent to Boston, since troops have to be sent to Massachusetts to keep order, what are they going to have to do? Pay for it. All right. Think about this. Okay? You already answered this. Where did Boston get its money from? Trade. What's been shut down? Trade. How are they going to pay for it? You can probably guess. They're going to have to be taxed, right? Or they're going to have to. But this one goes even further than what the other quartering act did. These soldiers could be housed where? In your home. Well, you would have to feed them and not clothe them, but feed them and house them. That one's wildly popular, right? Sarcasm. Everybody hates that one. Finally, the Administration of Justice Act. This one's the most complex one. Okay? But it's not hard. Basically, what it does is closes down Massachusetts courts. if the Government Act shuts down the government, then the Administration of Justice Act shuts down the courts. Okay, so rebellious people like John Hancock or whoever, okay, you get arrested for some sort of rebellious act. Where would you be put on trial? You can't be put on trial in Massachusetts because they're shut down. So where would you be put on trial? In England. What are your chances of escaping conviction in England? 0. Okay? So you would be put on trial in England. All right, these 4, okay, here's where a lot of people get confused, okay? A lot of students who are studying the American Revolution, they think that these coercive acts apply to every colony. They don't. Who do they apply to? Only to Boston and to Massachusetts, right? So why does every other colony freak out? Bingo. How do they know what's happening in Boston? Because what do we talk about? The committees of correspondence, right? So all the other colonies know what's been happening. And when they see the response, they're all freaked out. Okay, now there's another part of the Intolerable Acts called the Quebec Act. Okay, which actually turned over some fishing waters back to France. Okay, you don't have to, nobody cares about the Quebec Act. Okay. How do we know they're freaked out? Because this happens. The First Continental Congress. 1774, right after the Intolerable Acts, the colonies agree to send representatives as quick as they can to Philadelphia. Why Philadelphia? Biggest city. Okay. 55 delegates from 12 colonies will make it to the meeting. All right, who doesn't make it? Georgia. Okay. They're just behind. They can't get there. Okay. So 55 delegates from 12 colonies arrive with, and really the only thing on their agenda is, what do we do about this? Okay. What do we do about this? So for the first time, you have virtually a colonial-wide assembly that's going to start trying to piece together what they're going to do. When they get there, they decide that every colony is going to vote as a colony. Okay? So Rhode Island would have as many votes, or have as much of a vote as Pennsylvania would, or Virginia, or whatever. Okay? So they get there, they meet. A couple of things they decide on. Okay, number one, they tell Massachusetts, hey, you gotta be strong. Okay? Start arming yourselves. Roll out your militias. Start storing up weapons. Why would they say that? What do they think's about to happen? A fight. Okay? So, and they advise the other colonies to start doing that too. Start rolling out your militias, start rolling out and storing up your weapons. All right, let's talk, hold on, before we go any further here. I want you to, we'll do a little military talk here for a second before we get off into the war later on. Tell me what a militia is.
A local group of people volunteering to protect the apartment.
So today, if we had a militia in Mississippi, what would it be?
Ragtag.
Yeah. Yes, it would be usually what it was is every town. All right, let's just talk about Boston, or let's just talk about Massachusetts, okay? every town in Massachusetts had a responsibility for training the militia. And so once, usually a month, the guys would all get out. We would train, okay? We would shoot the guns, shoot our mouths off, okay? Shoot the guns, probably drink, okay? But we were supposed to be training, okay? All right, look, militias were designed to help protect those towns in case of an attack, right? You would know how to use your weapon, you would know how to respond to basic commands, okay? But they're not well trained, they're certainly probably not well led, and they are, well, for the most part, militarily a joke, okay? But they did have weapons, excuse me, and that was what they're trying to get them to do. Get the weapons stored up, get the weapons into a place to where the British won't seize them, okay, and be prepared because something could happen, okay. The delegates then return back to their colonies, and they're trying to drum up support, okay. They are trying to drum up support for what could happen next. Okay, they're trying to drum up support for Massachusetts or for their own colonies to start taking some of these actions, appropriating certain funds, getting ready to get ready, okay? And you get this, okay? All of you have probably, at one time or another, run into Patrick Henry's speech, okay? All of you are only familiar probably with the last few words, give me liberty, give me death, okay? But Patrick Henry is making a much more impassioned plea than what you see here, okay? All right, I want to give you a caveat here, okay? There's a little warning. Historically, we're not exactly sure how accurate of a representation this is of Patrick Henry's speech, because there's no real copy of it left. Most of what we know about it was written down by people who attended his speech when he was at the Virginia State House when he was giving it, okay? So there's not a definitive sort of idea. This is our best sort of from all of the different transcriptions or the different recollections. This is kind of the best guess. But Patrick Henry was a fiery orator, okay, and not scared to throw in a few expletives here or there. If you notice, those are missing from this text, okay? So it's been sanitized a little bit. All right, the people that were there kind of made it a little bit cleaner than it probably really was, okay? But there are certain things that they all remembered, and that gets put into what eventually is really our text, okay? And there are certain things and certain points that he makes that everybody remembers. And I'm going to read a couple of them, okay? In this sort of paragraph right here, he's doing some things, okay? But when you get right here, this is what I want to kind of point out, okay? So you can kind of look right there where he says, we have petitioned, okay? And I'm going to kind of pick up there and we'll talk a little bit about it, okay? We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated, we have prostrated ourselves before the throne, and have implored its interposition to arrest the tyrannical hands of the ministry and parliament, okay? Our petitions have been slighted, our remonstrances have produced additional violence and insult, our supplications have been disregarded, and we have been spurned with contempt from the foot of the throne. In vain, after these things, we may indulge the fond hope of peace and reconciliation. There is no longer any room for hope. If we wish to be free, if we mean to preserve inviolate those inestimable privileges from which we have been so long contending, if we mean not basely to abandon the noble suggestion in which we have been so long engaged, in which we have pledged ourselves never to abandon until the glorious object of our contest shall be obtained, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left us. Whoa. You remember when I told you guys that there comes a time where there are certain groups of people out there that would never have entertained the notion of breaking away from England. By 1774, what are you starting to see? It's pretty clear here what Patrick Henry is saying, right? Now, is he entertaining the idea of independence, of breaking away, or is he simply saying we must fight for our rights as Englishmen? Okay, and that's an important distinction. Which one is he doing here? Okay, I think you get it by reading the next paragraph. This paragraph's my favorite. Okay, it's not even the give me liberty or give me death. What he says next is, to me, the best part of the speech. They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be in the next week or the next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed and when a British guard shall be stationed in every house? Shall we gather strength by irresolution and inaction? Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs and hugging the delusive phantom of hope until our enemies shall have bound us hand and foot? Sir, we are not weak if we make a proper use of those means which the God of nature hath placed in our power. The millions of people armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country as that which we possess, are invincible by any force which our enemy can send against us. Besides, sir, we shall not fight our battles alone. There's a just God who presides over the destinies of nations and who will raise up friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. Besides, sir, we have no election. If we were base enough to desire it, it is now too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat, sir, let it come. Now, you read that, and you know what choice he's made. Okay? What is it? We got to break away. Okay? This is so interesting. Okay? Because it sums up a lot of the things we are hoping for when we get to this point. This is 1774. We're not to the point of independence yet. But look, we got to fight. Okay? We got to fight. We're not alone. Other people will come and help us. Okay? And if we don't fight, chains and slavery. Okay? Chains and slavery. And, by the way, he's a prophet. Because look, he gives this in March. Okay? Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. Okay? The war's already started. That's what he's saying. Okay? And we can't just sit here. It is vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. The gentleman may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? Was it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God, I know not what other course or what course others may take. But as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Powerful. Okay? So he's trying, and there are others out there making the same argument. Okay, our brethren are already in the field. Okay, it's already happening. Why are we still here twiddling our thumbs? Okay, and he's right. He's right. Within just a few days, in Boston, things are picking up. In Massachusetts, things are picking up. Remember, they had been advised to go out and store up arms, okay? And they had already started to prepare for the eventuality that the British are going to try to take those arms, okay? And so you have the famous ride of Paul Revere and William Dawes, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which you all have heard before, to warn the Bostonians that the British were coming, that the British were making their move. And we all know what they're going to try to do, seize the weapons. The British are going to march towards two Massachusetts cities. They'll march out of Boston towards two Massachusetts cities at Lexington and Concord. Okay? So a major or a sizable British force will march their way towards Lexington, where they are engaged by a small colonial force of Minutemen. Why were they called the Minutemen? Supposedly they could be assembled in a minute's notice. Okay? But what I tell you about the militia, they're not super well trained. They're not super well led. It's a small force at Lexington. And they get pummeled by the British. Okay? They disperse the colonials at Lexington quickly. Okay? They get hammered. Okay? The British move on to Concord, where they're supposedly the weapons are stored. They get there and they're all gone. Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, remember? So they're all gone. This British force then decides it has to turn around and head back to Boston. And any force in retreat will suffer its greatest casualties. One, because you know where they're going, okay? If they turn around and head back to Boston, then anybody from that area knows which way they're going to go, right? And so what happens to this British force as it makes its way back to Boston? It gets constantly ambushed, okay, by colonial forces. From Concord all the way back, they are hammered by the Americans, okay? The shot heard around the world, okay? You guys are way too young, but when I was a young yonker, there used to be a thing that would come on the Saturday morning cartoons. Okay? For us, Saturday morning cartoons were the best. You could wake up early on Saturday, and you would get to see everything from Scooby-Doo to Jabberjaw to whatever. Okay? And every station had, the three that we got, all right, ABC, CBS, and NBC, had their different little, shows. But on ABC, they had a little program called Schoolhouse Rock. And probably some of you run across it every now and then. I'll actually play you one later on. Okay? But Schoolhouse Rock was, they would take something and they would sing about it. Okay? Really catchy tunes. And they kind of taught you everything from math to history to it's how I learned the preamble to the Constitution. Okay? So, but one of the songs was The Shot Heard Around the World. Okay? The start of the revolution. It's what it was kind of a little from Rain. The little song was, it was Shot Heard Around the World, start of the revolution. What else? Everyone get ready on the march. Take your rifle, take your gun, report to General Washington. Okay, so you get the idea. All right? So, but the Shot Heard Around the World is one of these everybody looks at what the Americans are doing here and abroad in Europe and goes, well, what are they doing? Okay? If you, if Vegas and Vegas odds existed, all right, in this time or at this time, and you went to gamble on which side was going to win. Right? The Americans and the British are going to fight, and we're going to gamble on which one wins. You would get enormous odds for the Americans. Everybody thought these guys had lost their minds. Okay, this would be like, your 5-year-old toddler going to fight Mike Tyson. Okay, or your little cousin's pee-wee football team going to play Alabama. Okay, victory may happen if the entire team or Mike Tyson gets struck by lightning. Okay, but it's not going to happen. Okay, and most people think that that's sort of what we've gotten ourselves into, because the British are the most powerful nation in the world economically, militarily. They already have an army stationed here. It's not like they have to get here to fight us. Okay, and so most people think that we have really lost our minds. Okay, after the fighting at Lexington and Concord, okay, then they will meet again. In 1775, the delegates reassemble. This time all the 13 colonies are there. And they reassemble in what becomes the Second Continental Congress. For all practical purposes, okay, now I want you to kind of understand this, because sometimes it's not pointed out enough, I don't think. For all practical purposes, this is going to become the government of America from now through the Revolution until you get to the passage of the Articles of Confederation. Okay, our first real government. Okay, so the Second Continental Congress essentially becomes our new colonial government from the time of the Revolution all the way till the time we adopt the Articles of Confederation. The first thing they do, which is probably the smartest thing they did, was they look around the room and they see this big, tall, huge Virginian named George Washington, wearing his military uniform. And what do? Whoop! Yeah, congratulations, you are now the head of the colonial army. Okay, congratulations, get to work. Good idea, bad idea. Terrific idea. Well, we look back on it now, and we say it's a terrific idea because he wins. Okay, but there was a time where Washington, especially early on, was not doing so well, and he almost gets removed. But Washington, looks like a duck, talks like a duck, quacks like a duck, swims like a duck. He looked like an army guy. He was big. He was commanding. Okay, and he has military experience. Okay, and so he gets the job. Okay, great idea. The other thing that they're going to do pretty quickly, they're going to try one last time to appeal to the king and the parliament. It's called the olive branch petition. When you give somebody an olive branch, what are you giving them? It's a symbol of what? Peace, right? So they're going to reach out to the king one last time. What's the response from the olive branch petition going to be? The king rejects the olive branch petition and declares them all to be an open rebellion. Okay? What's the punishment for people who are treasonous and considered to be an open rebellion? Death. Okay? So they kind of realize that, as Franklin will say later on, all right, we better all hang together or we will surely all hang separately. Okay? So Richard Henry Lee will make a motion pretty quickly into this meeting that these 13 colonies of and of right ought to be free and independent states. And a committee will be appointed to draft a statement for independence. That committee will have some important members on it. Ben Franklin, John Adams, but the most important guy that they draft and put on the committee is who? Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson is going to borrow from some of his own writings, steal from John Locke, and only with some minor changes. There's a few, which Jefferson always hated too, by the way. What will come out of it will be a statement that will then be adopted by the entire Congress, and you guys know that that becomes what? That Declaration of Independence. Okay. Wow. Well, the first words of the Declaration of Independence. Oh my God. Okay. You better know. Okay. Between now and next Tuesday, go read the Declaration. Okay. Go read it. We will talk about it on Tuesday. Okay. And we will start the war on Tuesday as well. Okay. All right. So we've gone from, think about it. What I tell you. We've gone from nobody wanting to break away to, well, at least a third of us thinking we need to break away. Okay? What's the Declaration of Independence besides a Declaration of Independence? Declaration of what? War. Okay? So we are on that way. All right. Thanks, guys. See you guys next time. Don't forget about getting your test done and getting all that stuff done before those deadlines hit. Okay? All right. See you guys.